this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. Today we're going to talk about Firefight. I'm going to do an overview and I'm going to do a review. It's going to look a lot like the Halo one if you didn't watch that. There's a card going somewhere in here. I don't know. I'm just going to point every direction. And check it out. It gives my initial thoughts on Halo. It's going to be a very similar format for this. We're going to talk about what Firefight is. We'll do a brief overview of the game. We're not going to dig into the factions too deep. I'll probably just mention a few and kind of how I perceive them to interact based off of my experiences with them so far, and we'll kind of go from there. So, in true review fashion, we'll talk about things that I think the game does well. We'll talk about whether it does activations well, line of sight, etc. Like, there's a lot of things that it does well. We'll have things that I think the game could improve on, and that's going to be like a pros and cons list is what these are going to be. Again, if you didn't watch my Halo 1, check it out. You'll really understand the format, and you'll understand it as we go. It's pretty easy. Firefight is Mantic 40K analog, for lack of a better way of describing it. I know a lot of people who watch my videos are 40K players, so going back to 40K is always the easiest way for me to explain things to them. So it's their science fiction tabletop strategy game. It's action based instead of phase based. So it's going to be very similar to Dead Zone if you're a Dead Zone player, or Necromunda, or Kill Team. You're going to take turns activating units, and those units are going to perform all the actions you want them to perform, and that's going to be it. Very straightforward, very easy to understand. It is set in Mantic's Warpath universe. I don't know anything about it. For those that watch my stuff, they know I'm not like a huge lore guy. I know enough about 40K lore that I could carry on a conversation with you, but I'll be out of my depths very quickly. I'm very much a game first player. Is the game fun? If the game's fun, then I'll invest my time into learning about the background. So I don't know a ton about it, but I will be looking more into it as I play more games. First part, when you go to play a game, is making a list. This is going to be very standard, very straightforward. Maybe not every game, most games have this to some extent. And Mantic's version of this is pretty intuitive. You have to take troops, and then each troop selection unlocks a support or command slot, and then it also unlocks a specialist slot, and then you have to take more troops if you want more of those slots. It does use points like most games, and you do have to have some sort of commander, but that's pretty much it. So in a 1,000-point game, you might take a unit of troops, and then take a commander, and then take a specialist, and then take a unit of troops, and then take a support unit, and then take a specialist. So you have these options. It's like I said, it's pretty straightforward and intuitive. The first time I looked at it, I was like, this doesn't make sense. But I'm coming from a 40K background, and once I sat down and really spent like more than 30 seconds reading it, I thought, okay, this actually makes sense. And then in addition, Mantic actually has the Mantic Companion. I'll link that in the description. It gives you everything you need to make a list. And I think for free, you're allowed like 2 or 3 lists. Maybe it's only one. I don't remember. But you are allowed at least one free list. So you can kind of play with it and see how it works. Once you have your lists, you're going to choose your scenario or mission. Again, this is going to be very similar to most games. So you don't have to worry about, oh, this is deviating from the norm. However, where it changes is once you've got your list, you got your mission, before you deploy, you do what's called a recon roll. And that's kind of like a priority roll, but what the recon roll does is it's a number of dice you roll based off of bonuses your commanders give, and then there's certain other units that give those same bonuses. They're called tactician units. So if you've got a tactician unit and a commander, you'll get bonus dice based off of both of those units. You're going to roll all those dice, and then whoever rolls higher wins that roll off. And then they can choose whether they want to deploy first and go first, or if they want to deploy second and go second. And each one has its own set of pros and cons. And then there's a few other benefits you can get with regard to deployment based on your recon roll, but I'm not going to dig into that right now. I'll probably do that in a deeper rules dive. As we all know, I tend to kind of get into the nitty gritty of games and really dive into how they interact. We'll probably do that with this game because I have had a blast with it. And if indeed Mantic does release a Halo game that is like 40K sized, it will be based off of this rule set. So diving now could prepare you in the event that they do that. Once armies are deployed, first round begins. Again, very standard fare. You'll have scout movements, stuff like that, but it's all very standard fare. Now let's talk about what stands out. Like I said, there isn't much outside the standard gaming fare when you take a really like cursory look at this game. It's alternating activations, it's action based, and it seems very simple and it just seems kind of like, yeah, okay, it's a game. The game does use command points, and those command points work like orders, and you can use your orders to activate auras. And so again, we're not deviating too far outside of the norm here. Where it shines in this regard is that there's no generic orders outside of two. The first one is you can remove a pin token, which is very important. Again, we'll do a rules dive later on that, but just know that pin tokens are very important to controlling yours and your opponent's action economy throughout the game. And then there's another generic order that lets you chain activate. We'll kind of dig into that a little bit later. I'm not going to dig into it right now, but we will touch on that. So it uses these command points, the orders, and the auras in an effort to give each army its own distinct feel. And it also uses USRs or Universal Special Rules. And again, that's a term you're going to be familiar with if you're an old Hammer player or an old World player, because that's like an old GW, and I'm sure other companies have used it, but that's an old GW term for when they just have a bank of rules that everybody can kind of pull from. One of the other things that really stood out to me, though, is that they have mechanics that force you to re-roll, force your opponent to re-roll their dice. And they're really neat without being overly obnoxious and overbearing. And a good example of that is Marauders, which is the orcs, right? They have a rule called Resilient 1 on almost all of their units. And what Resilient 1 is when you roll the, I'm going to say wound die, but it's not actually that, but we'll call it a wound die because that's the closest analog that 40K and AOS players are going to have for now. I can force you to re-roll one wound die because they're resilient 1 whenever a unit attacks them. So if I shoot at an orc unit with 4 dice, 3 of them hit, I roll my next 3 dice. If only one of those results in a wound, I can force you to re-roll that, and then if it fails, you don't do any damage. But it's only one, like it's a parenthetical value. So more durable units might be like Resilient 3. I think I ran into that at the tournament. I forget. I think it was Mazen Labs had access to that on a couple units, which was pretty spicy. So, and there's also ways to overcome it. So there's things that will ignore Resilient also. So again, it's kind of, you have all these simple rules, but the way you can kind of layer and stack them is what makes the game feel very complex, for lack of a better word, like very deep. And that's what makes it stand out, is that on paper you're like, oh, this is a very simple game, but then as you play it, you're like, wow, there's a lot of depth here, and that's really cool. So let's talk about ease. Again, a lot of the same kind of criteria I used for Halo, I'm going to use here. The one that's gonna be missing was fit and finish, because this isn't really like a pre-bought box, so there's not really a reason to grade it on its fit and finish. The models you buy are the models you buy. Overall, the game's relatively easy to get into. Inexpensive models, and really it is. Like, 2 players can get a 2-player starter box, which are probably, if I had to guess, about 600 to 800 points per side, plus a rule book, and I believe dice. So it's like you get everything 2 players need to play. It's like $120. You can't beat that. So again, inexpensive models, they don't require a ton of assembly. It's less assembly than most like GW models might take. But I will say they're not quite as nice as GW, but we'll touch on that later. Some of the models do lack instructions, which is kind of frustrating. If you're not a seasoned hobbyist, that can be very daunting. I bought a Plague box, it's the starter box, and it's got the little mule or Bronco or whatever it's called. And that thing doesn't have instructions in the box. So I had to like dry fit it all together as best I could. And when I couldn't figure it out, I ended up Googling it. And there's a dude or lady, I assume it's a guy, I don't remember, but I want to say it was a guy. Doesn't matter. There's a person on WordPress that had kind of blogged their experience building it and they made instructions for it. And that helped a lot. So again, there are resources out there, but not having them in the box is a little frustrating. The rules are very easily accessible. The Mantic Companion has all of the core rules for free. You do need the subscription to access the USR definitions. So if you want to know what resilient does, you need the subscription, which I can't fault them for that. You know, that's fine. If I and when you buy the two-player starter boxes, they come with a rule book anyway. So again, the rules are easy to access. There's really good 3D printing support for like upgrade sprues, and then some of the models actually you can 3D print through their website. They won't print them for you. You just buy the STL and you can print them, which is awesome. It's good to see somebody kind of embracing that side of the hobby. And, for the most part, most of the rules make logical sense. And even when they don't break the game's logic. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. Like when we talk about line of sight and range and stuff, um, they follow the in-game logic, even if they don't make true logical sense. And a good example of that is the way line of sight works. You use your sergeant or unit champion or whatever term you want to use. If your sergeant can see the target, then all of the models in your unit are assumed to see the target. This is done to simplify measuring in line of sight. You don't have to measure it from every model. This makes sense. Where it can be very kind of like, where it stops making sense at times is when I can just poke my sergeant out and then I can have 10 dudes behind a wall that can't see anything. But because my sergeant can see, all 10 of them can see because you're not measuring line of sight from model to model. And that's more what I mean is that, you know, it might not make sense in my head, but it follows the logic of the game. So that is a positive. Like, it doesn't have to necessarily make sense to me as long as it makes sense within the confines of the rules that have already been established. Overall, for ease, I'd say it's a 3 out of 5. Core rules are very easily accessible, they're easy to read. But some of the models lacking instructions, and just the fact that it's a bigger game kind of already gives you a hit. Like, I don't know that I could ever give a 40K size game a 5 out of 5, just because when you start getting into armies that big, the game just gets more complex. Interactivity, the game is predicated around alternating activations. You pick a model, you activate it, your performance actions. So we're talking about like similar actions to be found in Dead Zone and Halo. They're not all the same, but it is from the same company and it's all kind of the same verbiage. There is an order, like I said, where you can chain activate an extra unit. So if I have my activation, I can activate a unit. Then I can spend a command point to activate a unit. But you can only do this once before your opponent can activate, before your opponent must activate. So I couldn't spend 5 command points to just activate 5 units. I can only do it once. And it's, again, we're going to dig into it later, but it's important to note that that's not technically an order, which does allow you to do some other things when you do that. And then if you get and take priority turn one, so if you decide you're going to activate first, you cannot chain activate if you go first on your first activation. You activate one unit, period, end of discussion. Now, your opponent, when they activate their first unit, can chain activate. So that's where I said earlier that going first or going second has its own set of, you know, good pros and cons. There we go. Scoring does typically happen at the end of the round, and what that does is it makes for a very interesting dynamic and adds a very deep layer of strategy to the game that, it almost becomes a mini game. Do I want to activate this unit now to try to get them on the objective, or do I kind of hold them back and wait to see what my opponent does, and etc.? So it does add a layer of complexity. The game becomes very deep through strategy rather than deep through rules, which I think is what makes it shine so well. And then you couple that with the fact that you have abilities like countercharge and controlled fire and all these other things that add another level of interactivity and strategy. Countercharge is exactly what it sounds like. If I've not activated or I have an Overwatch token, which again we're not going to dig into, all you need to know is if I'm eligible to activate, if you charge me, I can countercharge, and it helps mitigate the bonuses you would get from charging. So again, it adds to that. Do I activate this unit now, or do I leave them as a charge deterrent? And that actually was really important in the tournament. When I was playing round 2 in the Marauders game, Jordan, he really wanted to charge some of my assault boys. I had some assault operatives, and he really wanted to charge them, but I was intentionally leaving them for last to kind of prevent that charge, because he would have had a hindered charge. We would have fought at the same time. He wouldn't have the +1 to hit, if I remember right. And really, what ends up happening is that we do our damage at the same time. And because of that, there's a good chance my operatives kill his Storm Boys. I think there's skyscrapers in Mantic. But there's a good chance they kill them, and maybe I lose 2 or 3 guys. So he'd have to trade a whole unit to kill like a couple models, because he's not doing his damage first to help mitigate my efficiency. So it's one of those, like I said, like it just adds a layer of depth to the game. Overall, I think the game promotes a lot of interactivity, a lot of communication between players, and it almost always feels like two players are playing a game. And I would honestly give this a 5 out of 5 for interactivity. I thought it was a fantastic and interactive game. Investment. Is the game worth the time and money to get into? And this is obviously probably the most subjective of my grading metrics. I don't know anything about the Warpath universe, like I said. And honestly, when I've Googled it, I haven't found much outside of like some superficial fluff pieces. But I also haven't dove really hard. I haven't looked for any kind of like background videos on YouTube or anything. I'm sure somebody's done something somewhere. But I can look up Battletech very quickly. I can look up Fallout, because that's a tabletop game, very quickly. I can look up Halo, obviously, but these are all established IPs. I get it. Star Wars, like all these established IPs, I can look them up very quickly. So if you're in it for the story, I can't speak to you on this, because I'm not first anyway. And then in addition, like the little bit of research I've done hasn't really yielded a ton. So if your investment is in the like reading the books or that type of thing, I don't know that I can help you here. I would say the model quality is pretty good. It's gone way up since the last time I've looked at Mantic games. I looked at them once about 10 years ago when I think Kings of War first came out, somewhere in that time frame. It was like 2012 to 2014, somewhere in there. And when I looked at them now, I was like, holy shit, man, these things look a lot better. It's still not GW quality, but I would be hard pressed to say that anybody makes nicer models than GW. And that's to me just like a statement of fact. Like, when it comes to making models, they're probably the best in the business. Now you could definitely make arguments against their rules or whatever you wanted to, but when it comes to making models, they're gorgeous models. They require very little prep work. You don't have a lot of mold lines, things like that. So, but overall, the models do look nice, and when they're painted, they paint up very well. But they tend to require a bit more prep, so you're having to scrape a lot more mold lines and stuff like that. If you like fun games that are interactive and easy to learn but take a lot of practice to master, think like even like Super Smash Brothers, right? That game has 3 buttons. but you can't just go push 3 buttons and win. Like, you have to understand the game. If you like games like that where it's like, hey, this is actually pretty easy, but if you want to be good at it, it's not so easy. This is for you. If you like interactive games that are very deep in strategy without being deep in rules, excellent game for you. Again, just like I said with the Halo game, Mantic has been in business for 10 plus years. Firefight is on its second edition. I think technically this might be its third. You can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I will probably misspeak here. I know if I remember right, Warpath was like Firefight first edition, but I think we've had Warpath, then Firefight, then Firefight. But again, if I'm wrong on that, let me know. But if that's the case, that's technically its third edition. So there's a good number of factions to choose from, and they're actually testing a new one. So obviously, like, this is a game that's getting support and growth. So again, like, probably not going anywhere anytime soon. And then the scale, like, I don't know if this is worth it for the investment section, but I felt like putting it in the investment section because if you're in it for the hobby side, the scale on the models seems to be a little weird. I've got zombies that are the same size as enforcers, and enforcers are almost like the Space Marine analog, and zombies are zombies. So again, it just seems a little weird sometimes when I've got these like power armor guys with big shields and guns and stuff, and then I've got Jim Bob Cooter over here who's also a zombie who's the same size. Like the scale just seems a little weird sometimes. And then the vehicle scales are a little wonky also. So again, if you're in it for the hobby side, scale might influence your take on the investment. But generally speaking, a lot of Mantic games tend to be miniature agnostic. And even when I went to the tournament, the only thing they said about proxies was if you don't have official Mantic models, you can't win best painted. So if you want to use your Imperial Guard as GCPS, I don't think anybody's going to give a shit. And that's awesome. So again, financially, that's up to you. I give it a 3 out of 5 for investment, 3.5 out of 5. And a lot of that's because communities are kind of small right now and they can be kind of hard to find. Miniatures, if you want the official ones, can be kind of hard to find in America. Scale being a little wonky if you're on the hobby side. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but I'd give it a 3.5 out of 5. If you're only in it for the game aspect, I'd probably give it a 4.5 out of 5. That 3.5 is to account for like the hobbyists and the story-based players and that type of stuff. Things it does well. So normally I would do 3 pros, 3 cons, but there was one in here that I really wanted to bring up. And activations and actions I probably could have left out. It's pretty smooth. It's really logical. It does promote a lot of interactivity. The game does it well, but I think almost every alternating activation game does that well at this point. I like the terrain rules. When I first read them, I was like, bro, this is stupid. I don't understand how this works. This is bullshit. But that was part of why I went to the tournament, because I wanted to make sure I understood what I was reading. And when I went to the tournament, it was just like, oh, this actually just makes a lot more sense than I thought it did. I was making it harder than it needed to be. They are pretty simple, but the way they're written, your terrain matters. And you can use a variety of terrain. It's not like 40K where you just have to have these big footprints. It's more like I could put an armor container on the table and it can be a big deal. I can put some trees on the table and it could be a big deal. Because of how terrain works, what it looks like isn't as important as like how big it is, how you position around it, things like that. So again, it's a good example of easy rules, deep strategy, right? And that's what I love about it. It does a great job of, and again, I've been saying it a lot, it does a great job of taking a simple game and giving it a lot of depth and layers. You've got your alternating activations that can be supplemented with command points and Overwatch type mechanics. You've got a good scoring system and missions that rely on a variety of different things to score. So if you go to a tournament, you can't just build to hold objectives. You can't just build to kill. You have to kind of balance between the two. And anchoring list building in troop units kind of forces players to use a variety, and it doesn't ever really feel restrictive. When I went to the tournament, the only other Enforcers player at the tournament, I think he had like 3 of the Enforcers jets, and it was just like, here's my 3 jets, here's my bodies. There wasn't a ton on the table, but then when I put my Enforcers on the table, it was here's all the fucking bodies, right? And then here's my Striders. I had a couple Striders, and then I had some drones for some cheap activations. Like, it's one of those where it helps prevent people from just like, this is really good, I'm going to spam it, and forces them to use things that they might not normally use without being super rigid. And it offers you flexibility and rigidity at the same time. But the one thing that I wanted to touch on is that the game balances melee and shooting very well. Uh, However, you do need terrain on the table to make sure that that balance stays in place. Most of the shooting tends to be 24 inches or less, and even in the Enforcers, a lot of my shooting was 18 inches or less, right? And that's a shooting faction. Now, there are guns that have longer ranges than that, and you can bring a lot of them, but what you're sacrificing then, because a lot of those are built or set on vehicles that are like 80, 90, 100 points, is you're getting rid of like troops who have unit strength that can control objectives, or maybe they're expensive enough that you can't bring in another unit, things like that. So there's some trade-off there. But shooting does damage, melee does damage, but because shooting has the advantage of being able to be 18 inches away to do your damage, melee has a good way of balancing by really being able to manipulate the action economy. Like, if you lose a melee, you'll actually like if I charge you and you haven't activated, if I win that combat, you get marked as activated and you get a pin token. So a good player can look at the table and go, "Hey, this hasn't activated yet. If I can charge it and I can win this combat, I can shut down that activation." And then it'll go a step further. If you can shut down enough of the activations, you can really like change the way your opponent's playing the game. So again, it's one of those like real simple game, but there's a lot of depth to strategy here. Now, we can't talk about the good without talking about the bad. Things that could be improved. I would say vehicles feel a bit flimsy. And, part of that is probably intentional. Just because if they didn't, this game could get real bad real fast. And there are rules in place for heavier vehicles to help keep them on the table longer. But obviously, like, weight of dice will just chew through them no matter what. That just is what it is. And then obviously, using cover and terrain, army buffs can help out a lot. But if you put your tank in the middle of the table, don't think it's going to live. You know, it's just, it's going to die to like troop based laser guns. It's how it is. If you throw enough dice at it, it will die. Despite USRs and orders being used to give armies their own distinct feel, they can sometimes feel a bit samey. And what I mean by that is like Mason Labs, GCPS, and the Plague. Now, I haven't played against all of them, but it's hard for me to kind of like notice the difference. I'd have to probably play a bunch of games against them and really pay attention to see the nuances between them. But at surface level, I'm just like, these are all the same armies. And again, I get it. I'm new to the game, and that's probably off mark, but this is my initial reactions. And like I said before, access to models in the States can be a bit tough. I'm not going to dig into it. I already said it, or, I'm not going to say it again. And then, as an aside, the one thing I will say is that if Halo gets released as a firefight size game, this could be a problem. Halo as an IP is very well known. And I have already come out and said, if Mantic releases Halo, I'm done. That's it. That's all I'm going to play. I don't care what my local communities are doing. I will run events. I will go to events. I don't give a shit. Like, if you're telling me I can have ODSTs on the table or I can have elites, I don't care. I'm there. That could be an issue because now we have two games from the same company that are competing for the same space. Now, that being said, even if Firefight does get boxed out by Halo, that's probably a good problem to have if you're Mantic. Like, oh darn, people are struggling to decide which of my games they're going to play. So at the end of the day, it's not the worst thing that could happen. And really, if I buy Halo models, like a lot of that UNSC will transfer over to GCPS. So it's not the end of the world either way. That's going to wrap us up. I appreciate you hanging out with me for a little bit. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope, if you've got anything you disagree on, feel free to let me know in the comments. One other thing to wrap up November 2nd, if you are local to Northwest Indiana and you want to play in a firefight tournament, I am running one at the Knox Mason Lodge. I'll get a link in that I'll get a link for that in the description as well.